Greetings to you, and I hope that you are having a very happy Easter season. Even though we're still continuing our lives of social distancing and staying at home, and maybe by this point you're getting a little cooped up and you're hoping for some nicer weather to come our way soon. But in the meantime, for this third week of the Easter season, we get some really great readings this week. And I want to highlight in particular the readings from the Acts of the Apostles that we have for our first readings this week, because at the very beginning of this week and at the very end of this week, we have what I like to call a tale of two saints. So at the beginning of this week, we find the story of the martyrdom of Saint Stephen. Now, a little bit about Saint Stephen. Saint Stephen, we learn from the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 6, is part of the group of the men to become the very first deacons of the church. Now, Stephen is able to speak very elegantly and persuasively, full of the grace that he receives from the Lord, and this gets him in trouble with the council authorities. And he stands before them, and he witnesses to the truth of salvation history, culminating in who Jesus is as the Lord, and they are not very happy to hear that. And they drag him out and they stone him to death. And we get this story of his stoning in chapter 7. Now, with that happening, Stephen gets the distinction of not only being one of the very first deacons of the church, he becomes the very first Christian martyr. So, where this gets even more interesting now is that the Acts of the Apostles tells us that when the crowd went out and stoned Stephen to death, we find this figure named Saul there. The Acts of the Apostles tells us that the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And this Saul, it's also said, was consenting to his Stephen's death. And then just a line or two later, it says that a great persecution broke out against the church on that day, and Saul laid waste the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So this Saul guy is not a very friendly figure to the early Christians at all, which makes it even more incredible that just one chapter later in the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 9, and this is the reading that we find at the end of this week, Saul is on his way to the city of Damascus with orders to round up and imprison even more Christians. And on the way to Damascus, a bright light shines on him on the road, and he falls down, and he hears a voice calling out to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And that is the voice of Christ. So this is the story of the dramatic and famous conversion of Saul. And he goes from being one of the most zealous persecutors of the Christian and a man who was very happy to see Saint Stephen stoned to death to becoming one of the most zealous Christians of the early church and one of the most famous, because he becomes the apostle Saint Paul. Now, Saint Paul is somebody that I love very much because he just so happens to be my confirmation saint. He is the saint that I chose when I was in 8th grade because Paul was a writer. He has written almost half of what we have is the New Testament with all his letters that we have in there, and I've always been very fond of writing myself. So I've always had a big love for St. Paul, and in my years at the seminary, I've had a picture of St. Paul on my desk, and I have that same picture of him here at my desk here in the house in Miller City. So I love St. Paul for the fact that he was a great writer, and I certainly love his conversion story too, so I was really excited to see it come up in the readings for this week. But another thing that we can learn from St. Paul, and this goes back to him being one of the saints in this tale of two saints, him and St. Stephen, is that here you have this guy, St. Paul, who was very happy to see somebody like Stephen stoned to death. St. Paul was not very friendly to the Christian faith at all, but St. Paul himself underwent a great conversion and became one of the most famous and rightly zealous and most beloved Christians of all time. And that is a really great example for us, even down to the present day, because I'm willing to bet that each one of us can think of somebody, whether close to us or maybe not quite so close to us, that we know that is probably none too friendly toward the Catholic faith or the Christian faith. And it's very easy to, we rightly want them to see the truth and the love that we have in our Christian faith. But it also might be very easy to despair of them ever coming around to see what we wish that they could see about the faith that we love and that we hold so dearly. So it's really great to look at somebody like St. Paul, because St. Paul was a really big persecutor of the faith, and then he underwent this great conversion, a very dramatic one. We should say not everybody's conversion is as dramatic as St. Paul. St. Paul is kind of an exception as far as conversions go. Most conversions or reversions back to the faith if somebody drifts away usually happen over a period of time, so it requires a lot of patience on our part and perseverance and prayer for that person. But what a gift that we have in St. Paul, not only in his letters that he had to us after he converted, but also the whole story of his conversion too is really good for us to look at and to take hope in. And, who knows? He could even be somebody that you ask to intercede on behalf of somebody that you would like to see come to better know and love the truths of the faith that we share. So something for you to think about, maybe pray about too. You can pray to St. Stephen or St. Paul on behalf of somebody that you know and that you love. And speaking of prayers, know of my continued prayers for you during this time, especially in the noontime rosary that Monsignor and I pray every day for you and for your intentions. I hope that you continue to stay healthy and that you continue to stay well. God bless you. Have a wonderful week.